This hour on I-24 News, in the Middle East, hundreds of Palestinians burned tires, threw rocks, and clashed with Israeli police. On this day of rage, at least 50 Palestinians were injured.
Syria pounds rebel areas in Damascus with new airstrikes. Humanitarian groups say they are unable to get to civilians as the number of dead rises to more than 200.
Plus, the Olympic Games in South Korea are underway. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence sat just a few rows in front of the sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un.
From the I-24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Shuster and Tal Heinrich.
Nice open.
Thank you, David.
That was great. This was another day of Palestinian anger and clashes with Israeli police in Gaza and the West Bank. The outburst came after Hamas and Fatah militant groups called for a day of rage.
More than 400 Palestinians rioted in the streets. They burned tires and threw rocks at Israeli police. The new violence sparked by the killing of a Palestinian gunman who was accused of murdering an Israeli rabbi and father. Senior defense correspondent Shai Ben-Ari on the Israeli-Gaza border with more.
Yes, there were calls today for a day of rage by different Palestinian factions, and these calls were indeed answered here along the Israel-Gaza border by about 400 Palestinians who gathered at a number of different locations along the frontier to clash with IDF forces. Mainly they were burning tires, throwing rocks at soldiers positioned at different locations along this border. And indeed, there were some cases of injury. The Palestinian Health Ministry noting 19 injuries as a result of the clashes today, including one serious case of a head wound, apparently in critical condition. Most of these cases would have been results of tear gas and other non-lethal means, but in some cases when these Palestinian protesters approach the border itself and try to cross, a live fire is indeed used to make them move back, and in some cases they also fire towards the center of the body, leading in many cases to fatalities. We've seen that kind of thing in past weeks. Apparently today, just the one critical injury as a result of these clashes. All this happening while a Hamas delegation actually left this morning for Egypt to discuss with the leadership there the humanitarian situation, which is very grave indeed inside the Gaza Strip. It's something the Israeli defense minister does not want to characterize as a humanitarian crisis. Others might disagree, but we'll look to see if there's any sort of solution to that ongoing problem in Egypt. As for the situation in the Gaza Strip, it would not be a surprise to see similar events to the ones that we saw today in the coming weeks, as this has often been the case on Fridays since that announcement by the Trump administration recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital back in December. That's all for now from the Gaza-Israel border. Shai Ben-Ari for I-24 News.
To the north in Syria, residents in the rebel territory of eastern Ghouta in Syria are facing a new assault from the regime. There was a little boy crying out for his father. Since Tuesday, government airstrikes have killed more than 200 people. This is the deadliest week in that area of Syria since 2015. Eastern Ghouta and Idlib are two of the last rebel-held enclaves in Syria.
Dozens of children have been caught in the crossfire, but humanitarian groups say they are unable to gain access into the embattled areas and get them out.
An estimated 400,000 people are trapped in eastern Ghouta and face severe shortages of food, fuel, and medical supplies. The United Nations and the United States have called for an immediate cessation of hostilities, but Syria's main ally, Russia, said that was not realistic.
And meantime, Turkey has resumed its operation in Afrin. Turkey was forced to end its operations after Turkish-backed rebels shot down a Russian warplane over the area earlier this week.
The new offensive came just hours after Turkey's president spoke on the phone about the incident with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Turkey's military claims they are only going after terror targets in Afrin, but Kurds in the area say that villages full of civilians have also been repeatedly hit, with reports of more than 100 people there killed. To discuss all this, let's bring in Jonathan Wachtel, former spokesperson for the United States mission to the United Nations. What goes through your mind when you see those images like out of eastern Ghouta with kids that are getting killed.
It's just horrific to look at this, and then you think about how long this conflict has been, this war has been going on. It's year after year after year, and now, you know, you would think there would be this exhaustion and end finally, but here we have this uptick of the violence that is just so ferocious right now with the Russian airstrikes and Iranian forces and Hezbollah and others involved with the Assad forces really trying to crush Idlib and try to resolve it on their own terms.
To what extent do you think this uptick in violence in Syria now is by part a result of the fact that ISIS has been defeated by large?
To a certain degree, that's absolutely a very insightful thing that you're saying, Tal. It is true that now that ISIS is out of the way, you sort of have this recognition of this crazy ethnic soup in Syria, in which everybody's now trying to get, you know, position themselves as fast as they can from a position of strength, and you have these efforts that are really failing to resolve, you know, come to some sort of peaceful resolution of this through the UN. You know, Russia hosted the meeting in Sochi recently, which, you know, from their perspective was sort of an attempt to sort of claim that the conflict was kind of over and dictate things on their terms. It's a mess. We're not there yet, but obviously for the anti-Assad forces in Idlib, this is a scary time, and for those poor civilians caught in the middle of this thing, it's just gosh awful to look at those images. It just breaks your heart.
And then farther north in Syria, it was just 2 days ago when U.S. forces that are with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is essentially a rebel group, which includes Kurds and Arab fighters, they detected Syrian regime forces starting to launch an attack. The U.S. forces called in F-22s. They killed at least 100 Syrian regime forces. And Syria said this needs to go to the United Nations because the United States has been now engaged in war crimes. What do you make of that?
It's just the most crazy situation in which you have people who were opposed and took up arms to oppose a dictator named Bashar al-Assad caught in a fight. The United States trying to do the right thing of intervening in this in a way to try to at least support some sort of balance of power and try to you know, put this issue to rest and save civilians and save the people early on this conflict. Thankfully, the U.S. is in Syria. Now, the Syrian government claims that they're not authorized in there, so U.S. forces in there are considered illegal. You have to be invited in by a government of a country to have legitimacy.
But what is the reaction when the UN is asked to condemn one side or the other, particularly when the request is coming from Syria?
It's not going to happen.
Of course.
You know, it just can't happen. First of all, you're not going to have a Security Council when you have the United States sitting on the Security Council and two strong European allies who have veto power, France and the United Kingdom. It's just not going to happen. But you're going to hear this rhetoric. It's going to be echoing throughout, and it's for their own internal public consumption that they're doing this. But it's just a ridiculous situation.
But this attack does complicate things, the way it is viewed in the world and also here in the U.S., further intervening maybe in this war there on the ground. How would you define the U.S. involvement right now in the war in Syria? Is it more about fighting ISIS really, or is it countering Iran's entrenchment in Syria? What is the major concern to the United States right now?
Personally, I think it's both. You know, you still have ISIS, you know, just because ISIS has lost most of its territory, it's, you know, whatever little smidgen of it left where they control some areas, all those fighters went somewhere. The ones who weren't killed, they're there. They're still present in Syria. They're still capable of rising up and inflicting great harm. So there is the ISIS element and the need to have U.S. forces there and others to try to contain any sort of outbreak of it again. The thousands of fighters have now sort of melted into the civilian population and can easily take up arms and create havoc. And then you have another issue here, which is indeed Iran is ethnically cleansing vast territories of Syria and turning it into essentially a satellite of their own country. And the United States needs to be in there and push back. And then again, you have the United States also in neighboring in Manjib, neighboring Afrin, with forces on the ground trying to maintain, you know, some sort of control of that territory with the Kurds close to Turkey's border. So it's just such a mishmash of.
And you mentioned Afrin just briefly. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson will visit the Middle East next week. He will make a stop in Turkey. How do you see this playing out?
I wish he was making that stop earlier, because we would have been able to speak with Erdogan earlier about this Afrin invasion that is creating a horrible situation on the ground. A couple dozen children killed, dozens wounded, over 100 civilians killed in Turkish attacks. Just a crazy situation, and a siege in which the United Nations is, of course, very deeply worried that there's going to be starvation in some of these areas. They can't get aid in. They can't get aid into Idlib. Now they can't get aid into Afrin. So it would have been great had Rex Tillerson traveled over to Turkey earlier. He's going now, but he's going at a time in which things are very hot. The Turks have resumed airstrikes now that the Russians have opened up the airspace after working things out after the downing of their aircraft. So this is a very tense time for him to go in there. Let's hope that he manages to convince Erdogan to stop the hostilities. I'm not certain he will.
Yeah. Jonathan Wachtel, former spokesperson for the United States mission to the United Nations. Jonathan, great to have you in studio as always. Thank you.
Great to be here.
Still ahead on Crossroads, Vice President Mike Pence attended the Winter Olympics opening ceremony in Pyeongchang, South Korea. But despite sitting just a few rows in front of the North Korean VIPs, Pence had no interaction with the North Korean delegation.
Plus, more controversy at the Olympics. A speed skater accuses the committee of racism after lost out on carrying the U.S. flag during the opening ceremony. The 23rd Olympic Winter Games officially kicked off in South Korea.
The world's elite athletes paraded into an open-air stadium. It was kind of cold, but they paraded in as part of a colorful display during the opening ceremony. Correspondent Alex Stone has more from South Korea.
Under a spectacular sky filled with fireworks and thousands of drones, the Winter Olympics officially got underway here in Pyeongchang. The kickoff to 2 weeks of sports, at least for now, overshadowed by politics. North and South Korea's teams marching under one unified flag as athletes from both countries entered the stadium last in the Parade of Nations. The world's focus on Kim Jong-un's sister shaking hands with South Korean President Moon Jae-in. Kim Yo-jong also cheered on the athletes as they entered. Vice President Mike Pence sat in the same box but had no interaction with the North Koreans. Earlier on Friday, Pence met with North Korean defectors.
My wife and I wanted the honor of meeting with men and women who fled the tyranny of North Korea.
The theme of the opening ceremony, unity and coming together.
Great opening ceremony.
History was made here tonight. It's fantastic.
The program ending with South Korean figure skating icon Kim Yoon skating around on the ice and then taking the torch from two players from the joint women's hockey team, one from the South and one from the North, and lighting the cauldron that will burn throughout the games.
And that was Alex Stone reporting. There was another controversy on this day in the U.S. Olympic team. Speed skater Shani Davis skipped the opening ceremony after accusing the Olympic Committee of racism.
Davis was one of a handful of U.S. athletes up for consideration to hold the American flag during the Parade of Nations. The voting process ended in a tie, and Davis lost out to luge veteran Aaron Hamlin following a coin toss.
On Twitter, Davis called the move, quote, dishonorable. He ended the post with the hashtag Black History Month.
The U.S. Olympic Committee defended its decision, saying, quote, the Team USA flag bearer is selected using a detailed selection procedure that is fully driven by athletes. As is always the case, there were many worthy candidates for this year's honor.
And to discuss it further, we're joined here on set by diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson. Nina, first, what do you think about this coin toss?
Well,
we cannot overlook it. Is this how you decide who carry your flag?
Well, it's only day one, and then this is it wouldn't be the Olympics without some kind of controversy. But this is kind of disappointing. It doesn't show much sportsmanship on Davis' part, and there has been a bit of a backlash on Twitter about this. But I think the main event has been the very uncomfortable position that Mike Pence found himself in the stands watching the opening ceremony. Not sure if that was deliberate to place him quite so close to the North Korean delegation, including Kim Jong-un's sister, who's actually a very powerful lady in North Korea. She's described as the North Korean Ivanka. She's actually in charge of the propaganda department. So This is...
Ivanka, by the way, will be there for the closing ceremony.
Okay. Well, as protocol dictates, was it a mistake or did he do the right thing to essentially ignore her and not go up and shake hands or not prompt anything?
I think he had to ignore them. Although it might on the surface seem impolite in terms of world diplomacy, any kind of glance or handshake or any acknowledgement to the North Koreans could be misinterpreted. And that's partly the reason why he skipped a dinner that evening. He was at a large reception, and when he realized that he would be seated again in very close proximity to the North Koreans, he pulled out and had dinner with the team instead. So in the world of diplomacy, every gesture counts, so he has to be very careful at the moment.
Well, there are speculations that a big meeting could take place tomorrow between South Korea's President Moon Jae-in and the sister of Kim Jong-un's. Can there really be a diplomatic breakthrough on the sidelines of the Olympic Games there, or?
I think it's really just baby steps at this point. They did shake hands around the time of the opening ceremony. That's very, very significant. But Moon's agenda is very, very much, and it always has been, and this is how he ran for presidency, to try and encourage some kind of détente between the two. He wants to see the Koreas unified at some point, his parents were North Korean refugees, so that's his bigger agenda. But again, a lot of this is symbolic, so we'll just have to wait and see.
And speaking of symbolism, a lot of the Olympic organizers have said that they believe that this is a possible opportunity to get some sort of breakthrough along the Korean Peninsula by having the teams marching together and to have the VIPs from the different countries. Did diplomats, though, around the world see that same possibility, or are they a little bit more skeptical?
Well, I think there's deep skepticism, David, because this is really a propaganda coup for the North Koreans. They look civilized, they have a joint team, they're getting a lot of global attention, but then again, everybody knows what the real threat that North Korea constitutes, and I think the diplomatic community hasn't forgotten that.
Joint team right now, but after the Olympic Games, there will be a joint drill by the U.S. military and South Korea. Well, back to normal, right?
Absolutely. Nina Larson, our senior diplomatic correspondent, also helping us with Olympics coverage. Nina, thanks as always. Great stuff.
And coming up on Crossroads, massacre in Myanmar. A new investigation shows Rohingya refugees were systematically murdered and buried by government troops.
Plus, there is more troubling news about African and Middle Eastern refugees stranded in Greece. The United Nations reports a growing number of incidents involving sexual harassment and violence. The United Nations says a new report about the systematic killings of Rohingyas in Myanmar is, quote, alarming.
The investigation from Reuters accuses the Myanmar government of orchestrating and carrying out the massacre. The report quotes villagers who say the government troops killed at least 10 Rohingya men, dug a mass grave, and buried all the men inside.
When they were taking them away, they said, "Do not worry. We will send your sons back soon. We are taking them for a meeting."
The United Nations has vowed to look into the findings.
Yes, we're aware of this latest report, the details of which are very alarming. And this once more attests to the need for a full and thorough investigation by the authorities of all violence in Rakhine State and attacks on the various communities there. And of course, the Secretary General, as you know, has called for the release of the 2 detained journalists, and we continue to press for that.
Reuters says 2 of his journalists were arrested as a result of this investigation. They are currently awaiting trial. Myanmar's government has denied any wrongdoing.
There is new information on this day about the plight of Middle Eastern and African migrants stranded now in Greece. According to the United Nations, in the refugee centers, incidents of sexual harassment and violence are growing.
This as the plight of migrants in other parts of the world becomes a more difficult situation. I-24 News correspondent Marcus White has the story.
It's just after migrants arrive in Greece when the UN says some become victims of sexual violence. The UN says it received 622 reports from survivors of sexual violence. Nearly a third experienced assault or harassment after arriving in Greece. Experts say the number of victims is likely higher because many don't report the crimes. According to the UN, overcrowding is part of the problem. Much of the abuse is happening in reception centers in Greece, many of which are operating at double their capacity. More than 58,000 refugees applied for asylum in Greece, the most per capita of any European nation. Thousands of miles away in France, migrants face a different emergency. Nearly 300 migrants are camping in freezing temperatures near Paris's historic Canal Saint-Martin. Temperatures are expected to dip to -8 degrees Celsius or -17 Fahrenheit.
That is difficult, you know, cold, night time is some persons is sick, some persons is no good feeling, don't have a family here, difficult.
This 23-year-old migrant from Afghanistan is named Abdullah. Despite living through the winter on the streets, he has no regrets about leaving his homeland.
Like other country don't welcome refugee my country. In France, too much welcome in France.
But France has its share of critics over its handling of migrants. This sign reads, "The city council kills." Thousands of refugees sleep in the street under the snow. Meanwhile, in Yemen, the civil war continues to take a toll on people forced from their homes. The UN says 22 million people are in need in Yemen, and more than 85,000 have been displaced because of the ongoing war. The UN Refugee Agency is appealing for $200 million in humanitarian aid, with little hope that an end to the fighting is near.
I-24 News correspondent Marcus White now joins us here. Marcus, you finished this report with the refugees in Yemen. Can you tell us what are some of the biggest challenges that they're now facing?
So some of the people in Yemen, they flee their homes because of the violence, but the situation in Yemen is so bad that once they've fled their homes into one area, the violence then moves there, and then they have to leave their homes again. So, of course, Yemen is also facing a similar situation, as you saw in the video, to France, where they're soon going to be dealing with extremely cold conditions. And there's been a really difficult time getting supplies into Yemen. So you can imagine if you were forced to flee your home, you don't have a way to keep warm, you don't have blankets, and you don't have the aid that you need.
And you keep moving.
We saw in your piece, the refugee who spoke seemed to be supportive of France's refugee policy. Is France's policy lenient, or is it considered more harsh?
France does have one of the more lenient policies based on looking at European nations, and that's really because of France's President Emmanuel Macron. Also, Germany, very liberal policy there because of German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and also Sweden. Many migrants from around the world, there are 16 million migrants. A third of them come from Syria, and many of them are fleeing to Europe.
You also mentioned the sexual violence issue in the Greek refugee centers on the shores of Greece. What does the UN want to see being done in regards to that? What can be done?
So just a really horrific situation to hear about this, people being taken advantage of in their worst hour. But of course, they're asking for better lighting, they're asking for better security, and of course, they're asking for some solution to reduce the overcrowding. But with the number of migrants, it's kind of a difficult solution to try to solve.
It's hard to enforce the law in certain centers, refugee centers. I would assume it's also a challenge for the authorities.
Oh, absolutely. And then becomes the question, and it's unclear who is responsible for this sexual abuse, but is it the people running the centers? Is it some of the people fleeing the violence themselves? So when it comes to enforcement of this, when you're thinking about it, if it happens to be someone in security that's responsible, that becomes a bigger problem as well.
And as far as refugee centers in Europe are concerned, Greece considered perhaps some of the worst in terms of overcrowding and the proclivity for violence. And the UN says that there are a lot of people there in these refugee centers who now face a mental health emergency because of all of this.
And this has really been a problem that's been going on for a number of months. And could you imagine if you're not in your home, you're somewhere that you're not used to, you're in an overcrowded location. And when I say overcrowded, some of these locations have 2 to 3 times as many people as they were built to withstand.
Oh, wow.
Also, there's just not the medical treatment at these facilities. And then in addition to that, if you do have some sort of psychiatric issue that you were being treated for prior, at these refugee locations, the treatment for psychiatric issues isn't a primary concern. In fact, the situation's so bad, some people report having suicidal thoughts. One man said that he was so hungry that he started to see various things, and because of that, there's just a great need for psychological help in some of these situations.
And in addition to all of that, migrants really also face challenges on their journeys to these countries in Europe. I mean, we heard more about the European refugee crisis back in 2015, 2016. We kind of stopped reporting that, but this is all still ongoing.
Very much so. And in fact, there's a source that says that there's 549 migrants missing so far in 2018, the majority of them in the Mediterranean Sea. And one of the reasons for that is, if you can imagine, if you're on a rubber boat in the Mediterranean Sea with who knows what conditions, and many of these people are just fleeing when they get the opportunity, and of course they don't know what the weather's going to be, they don't know the conditions when they're leaving. Many people happen to die on the boats, which are overcrowded. In fact, many people do report sexual violence incidents then, and then in addition to that, there's just also the likelihood of getting sick.
Right. Marcus White here in studio with us. Marcus, thank you very much. Just ahead, what a 24 hours it has been in Washington, D.C. Senator Rand Paul held up a Senate deal for many hours until literally 1 in the morning. We'll have more on that story ahead. Plus,
I will tell you right away, White House Chief of Staff.
Some of it's the same. From California is recognizable.
And White House Chief of Staff John Kelly has reportedly told President Trump he is willing to resign following the uproar over Kelly's handling of the domestic abuse allegations.
just after 1 a.m. Friday morning in the U.S. Senate, 5:30 a.m. in the U.S. House, Congress voted to reopen the government, at least to fund the government, and then it was officially reopened when President Trump signed it a few hours after that.
A fight over the major bipartisan budget deal caused a temporary lapse in funding. Correspondent Tara Palmieri has the latest from Washington.
The second shutdown in less than a month ended early this morning with votes in both House and Senate.
The motion is adopted without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Despite support from a majority of Republicans and Democrats, for nearly 9 hours the government was officially closed because of one senator. Kentucky's Rand Paul objected to the budget deal because it increases the deficit.
I don't advocate for shutting the government down, but neither do I advocate for keeping it open and borrowing $1 million a minute.
For hours, Paul held up a vote on the bipartisan agreement brokered by Senate leaders.
My friend and colleague from Kentucky does not join the president in supporting the bill. And it's his right, of course, to vote against the bill. But I would argue that it's time to vote.
On the House side, many Democrats were upset that the agreement does nothing to protect the undocumented immigrants brought to the country as children.
If another country said that they were going to deport 800,000 people or place in jeopardy their protections under the law, we would be appalled.
But House Speaker Ryan called the bill a true compromise measure.
This agreement will also allow us to step off this carousel of short-term funding bills that do nothing but hurt our military and stymie our ability to focus on other important agenda items.
That was Tara Palmieri reporting.
Meantime, President Trump spoke out on this day about one of his closest aides who resigned from the White House this week in the wake of a sexual abuse and misconduct scandal.
President Trump defended his former top aide, Rob Porter, who resigned as staff secretary yesterday after allegations of spousal abuse by two ex-wives became public.
Thanks, guys. Well, we wish him well. He worked very hard. I found out about it recently, and I was surprised by it. But we certainly wish him well. It's a obviously tough time for him. He did a very good job when he was in the White House, and we hope he has a wonderful career, and hopefully he will have a great career ahead of him. But it was very sad when we heard about it, and certainly he's also very sad. Now, he also as you probably know, he says he's innocent. And I think you have to remember that. He said very strongly yesterday that he's innocent.
Let's bring in senior Washington correspondent Dan Raviv. Dan, is the White House Chief of Staff John Kelly in trouble now because of how he kept supporting the staff secretary Bob Porter?
He certainly might be, Tal. We do have word from White House officials that there's no resignation happening right now, but apparently Kelly did inform the president that if the president wants him to go, he'll go. Well, that's the way it works, needless to say. And yet one wonders whether it was loyalty that had General Kelly speaking out in support of Rob Porter, at least at first. Many on the White House staff say Porter was doing a really good job, just as President Trump was saying there. It was notable, however, that that the president said nothing sympathetic about Porter's two ex-wives who claimed that he abused them. Porter has now been forced to resign. He's out. And as for General Kelly, well, his story has not been consistent as to when he learned about problems involving Porter's security clearance, still not obtained, and the allegations of, well, in effect, beating his wife. It's widely expected that Kelly may be fired soon. He and his boss, President Trump, have had some falling outs on other issues recently. David and Tal.
Dan, on the issue of the budget, keeping the government open seems like good news for President Trump, but I guess the White House doesn't completely seem so happy about it. What's going on with that?
Well, mixed feelings expressed by President Trump. He said it was sad that the Republicans needed some votes from Democrats to approve that two-year spending agreement. And that's true. And as a result, he says some programs that Republicans don't like or don't want will be funded. The moral of the story, according to Trump, is that the nation should elect more Republicans to Congress this November. He would say that. David and Tal.
What happened to the immigration issue, Dan? Didn't the president want that to be settled by February 8th as the only way to avoid a government shutdown?
Right, that was our big story 3 weeks ago, and that was the idea. The president set a challenge that Congress would have to agree to a 4-part immigration plan, including new restrictions that Democrats don't like, but also extending the protected DACA status not only to 700,000 young people who already got DACA certificates, but in total 1.8 million people, and they would be offered a path to citizenship. Still, Democrats have not gone for that deal. They do not want to devote billions of dollars to building a wall on the Mexican border. Republicans, they don't want to say yes to that many new citizens. They say that would be amnesty. So immigration had no part at all in the deal to keep the government open. The Senate is expected to have a floor debate on immigration this coming week. No guarantees, not at all, of any compromises. David and Tal.
Dan Raviv, our senior Washington correspondent. Dan, thank you.
And meantime, Rand Paul had a lot more to say about this deal in his hours-long filibuster in the Senate.
Paul, who's a libertarian Republican from Kentucky, not only went after mainstream Republicans for agreeing to a deal that he said racks up the deficit, but he accused them of voting on a bill that he says they didn't read.
We have a 700-page bill that no one has read that was printed at midnight. No one will read this bill. Nothing will be reformed. The waste will continue, and government will keep taking your money irresponsibly and adding to a $20 trillion debt.
To talk about the politics of this budget deal, let's bring in Alice Hennigan, Trump's America columnist for the Global Metro Papers, and Dr. Gina Loudon, a member of the Trump for President Media Advisory Board and former RNC Trump delegate. Dr. Loudon, I want to start with you because I always thought the Republicans cared about deficits. What happened?
Well, I think that Republicans do care about deficits. The problem is that the Democrats held our military hostage. And at a time where there are great tensions with North Korea, with China, with Russia, you know, I imagine that most Republicans just felt like they were putting too much at risk to not go ahead and take care of things. And so they had to. And I agree with the president that if the American people want to be able to cut spending the way that the Republicans want to do it, you have to give the president a majority, a 60 or more majority, and that's where it has to go.
Alice?
It's laughable. I mean, David, in the pre-dawn hours today, Republicans obliterated any potential fiscal argument for ever voting Republican again, right? I mean, it used to be the Republicans were kind of stingy and mean, but they were at least fiscally responsible. So now we have a government completely controlled by Republicans that just stacked another $2 trillion, that's the one with a T, $2 trillion onto the national debt. And, oh, should I remind you that throughout Barack Obama's term, the deficits continued to shrink. Bill Clinton actually balanced the budget, so please tell me why anyone who cares about our economy ought to vote Republican.
Well, Rand Paul cares about it.
You can't say that with a straight face, honestly. President Obama was the most ridiculous spender ever. We know what he did to our debt. It was an absolute aberration of executive privilege. And this is an example of them trying to twist the narrative where it is their own people that precluded the cutting being done at every single turn. Nobody out here thinks that the Republicans don't seriously want to cut spending, and everyone knows diagnosed that the left wants to spend more on social programs? Or are you saying that's not true?
Hey, doctor, you guys control the government. You just put another $2 trillion on the federal deficit. Maybe you didn't notice that last night.
I can tell you this. When we, in 2018, have the 60 votes we need, we will cut that spending. And until then, you will continue to hold our military hostage. And I think it says more about where your priorities are, where your patriotism is, and where your hearts are, that you would hold our military hostage for your social programs.
Stop that.
Do we know where does the president stand on the deficit? Because it seems like
He doesn't. You know what he stands, honestly? It's been so frustrating for him to find a win of any sort. I have the impression that he'd sign anything, basically. I mean, just bring me a deal that I can put my name on, that we can get a budget through. You know what? This is the one that bubbled up out of the Republican politics. Rand Paul had it right? It used to be the Republicans were against deficits, but now this one's stamped GOP, and so they're all like little sheep running toward it.
Dr. Loudon, I mean, it is true. Go ahead. You can respond.
Well, I was just going to say that I do agree with Rand Paul that we do have a lot of spineless Republicans, and that's why so many people are so happy to finally have a president with a steel spinal cord who will stand up to this kind of thing. But
let me stop you right there, because if he did, let me stop you right there, because
it's utterly ridiculous.
But if the president does have a steel spinal cord, as you suggest, why doesn't he take this spending bill and veto it and say, I agree with Rand Paul. We cannot add $2 trillion to the deficit. Republicans and whatever Democrats you want, go back and start over and get me a budget bill that does not add for spending for anything other than, say, the military, if that's what he wants.
Trust me, I know he'd love to. The problem is that we have tensions overseas, as you know, with China, with Russia, with North Korea. And to not fund our military right now is dangerous.
No, I just said fund the military, but demand...
It was so sad to me. It was so sad to me when I saw General Mattis have to stand there and practically beg this legislature to be sure and not hold our military hostage, and then the Democrats to defiantly stand for more spending in the face of, holding our military hostage. That's not the way American government was
supposed to function. Were they putting a gun to the military, holding them hostage, and saying either the Pentagon gets more money or we shoot the military?
There is nothing constitutional about social spending. That is not part of the constitutional obligation.
Hold on, go ahead.
Listen, I sound like a broken record here, I know, but Republicans run the government, right? It's their budget, it's their House, it's their Senate, it's their president.
What would you have done if you were a Republican?
You know what I would have done? I would have not...
Government shutdown?
I would have not started with $1.5 trillion tax cut, the vast majority of which goes to the people at the very top. That's really why we're in this problem right now. So you cut your taxes, you become irresponsible about paying your bills, then you want to just stack more money on for political reasons. This was a shameful performance. I don't think you guys can ever make a fiscal argument again. People are going to laugh.
They're not going to laugh at the major tax returns they're getting, at the bonuses that corporations are giving because of the tax thing that you're calling crumbs, like your own leader, Nancy Pelosi. I let you finish.
Doctor, if anyone can get a word in here, we're all going to try. They're not going to be laughing at the stock market that is off the charts. They're not going to be laughing at record low unemployment for minorities in this country.
It's a good thing that you brought up the stock market. It's a great look, Doctor. It's a great thing that.
They're not going to be laughing at Republicans for their economic principles.
It's a great thing that you're giving Donald Trump credit for the stock market. So will you also give Donald Trump credit for the fact that the market over the last week has fallen by 10% since December?
Record highs, it's stabilizing. There's not an economist out there worth his salt that will tell you this has not been a
And there's not anybody out there who's been following the markets for the last week who says that it's stabilized right now.
Consumer confidence,
Doctor, it has dropped by 10%.
Let me answer it. Consumer confidence is at an all-time high. Unemployment at record lows. Homeownership among black families at an all-time high. What are you complaining about? I thought you on the left cared about these kinds of things, but you never did anything about them. This president is doing something about some the American people will
consistency here, and if you want to give Donald Trump credit for the stock market, which is fine, you should also say Donald Trump gets credit for the fact that perhaps because of the tax cuts or some other reason, a lot of people are now worried about inflation, and when people worry about inflation, the markets go haywire, as we saw over the last week.
Because of wage growth, because people are making money, and because we know that interest rates were held low under the last administration because of the $800 billion stimulus and all the spending that President President Obama did, and they knew that it had to be held artificially low.
David,
now we have a free market economy.
Should we just leave? Do you think?
I think we could go for a second.
Nothing
Doctor, we're all going to go for coffee. We'll catch you later, okay?
I have to tell you that this seems to be the new normal. Also outside of the new normal. Also outside of the U.S. You know, suspending the debt limit and also the deficit, never balancing a budget. Outside the U.S., it's very popular. It used to be a nation of many Rand Pauls.
Ellis Hennigan, Trump America columnist for Global Metro Papers, and Dr. Gino Loudon, a member of the Trump for President Media Advisory Board. Thank you both. We appreciate it.
Good to see you guys.
Thank you so much.
Coming up on Crossroads, it's a little-known fact that Saudi Arabia is home to one of the world's most revered Jewish heritage sites. Saudi Arabia says it wants to open up the site to the world, but in a bizarre move, Jews will still be prohibited from visiting.
Plus, exploring the world's largest kosher food and wine festival. We could use a bottle after that discussion. Crossroads continues after this. Saudi Arabia has some of the most restrictive travel policies in the world. Israelis are barred from entering, and some Jews have reportedly had problems getting visas.
But centuries ago, a Jewish community called Saudi Arabia home. Now the Saudi government is trying to cash in on that history. Culture correspondent Maya Mergit explains.
Let there not be two religions in Arabia. According to classical Arabic historians, this is what Muhammad said on his deathbed. In 641 AD, the Caliph Umar decreed that Jews and Christians should be removed from Arabia to fulfill Muhammad's command. Gradually, the ancient Jewish community of Saudi Arabia disappeared. Today, sites connected to the historically complex Jewish experience in the peninsula still exist and could become a major tourist attraction for the kingdom to cash in on. Khaybar, where the famous battle between Muslims led by Muhammad and Jews took place, resulting in the surrender of the Jews. Or Medina, which also had large ancient Jewish communities. But for now, Saudi officials are focusing on a less controversial type of tourism: archaeological sites predating the Abrahamic religions. They hope to attract more visitors to a UNESCO World Heritage Site with rock art from 10,000 years ago.
The site of Shwemis in the two mountains of Rata and Manjur is considered one of the most important and largest open museums in the world. It includes rocky facades, rock art, drawings, human and animal forms in their natural size.
The Hile province in the north of Saudi Arabia contains the biggest and richest rock art complexes in the kingdom and the wider region.
After the decision to issue tourism visas for foreigners, it will witness a significant increase in the next period, God willing.
Due to the importance of the site, its big size, and the rare rock art, the site joined UNESCO's World Heritage List as one of the largest and most important sites under the title Rock Art in the Higher region of Saudi Arabia.
The Saudi Commission for Tourism and National Heritage is upgrading transport and accommodation facilities to attract visitors, part of the country's wider efforts to boost tourism. Saudi Arabia recently announced plans to issue tourist visas to foreigners. This as the country seeks to diversify its economy. Maya Margit, I-24 News.
Who knew? Saudi Arabia, tourist attraction. Speaking of attractions, you got to visit an interesting exhibit here in New York this week.
Right. I was at Chelsea Piers, where I was tasting wines earlier in the week. Not just any kind of wine, but kosher wine. And the good part is that I still remember what I learned there. Take a look.
Wine to gladden the heart of men, and many hearts are sure glad over here tonight. New York's biggest kosher event of the year here at Chelsea Piers. It presents hundreds of wine from all around the world. But what makes a kosher wine kosher? Let's find out.
Most kosher things are ingredients-based. They have to contain kosher ingredients. Wine is not like that at all. Wine is not an ingredients-based product that has to be kosher. It has to be that from the crushing of the grape until the bottle is sealed, the wine is overseen and the production is overseen by a rabbinic Orthodox crew. What I like to say is that kosher wine is the wine that is so pure that it's you that dignifies it. It's you that makes it spiritual. It's you that makes it important and special.
During the holiday of Passover, wine is pretty much the main alcoholic drink that observant Jews can enjoy. They are required to give up anything that contains flour and most grains. But this year, as we learn over here, there's some new trends on the market, kosher for Passover, like this bottle of brandy, for example, that is made out of figs.
This vodka, 209, is kosher for Passover. It's made from pure sugarcane spirit. We found there was a need for high-quality vodka for Passover and a high-quality gin, and we've been making these since 2015.
Do you know what goes well with kosher wine? Well, kosher food. Apparently, there is a growing demand for kosher food in the United States, and it's not just Jewish consumers.
Kosher food is becoming more and more trendy, more and more relevant outside of the kosher community. Actually, we know that in the kosher aisle in modern supermarkets is a destination.
Many people who appreciate foreign wines today are kosher. The kosher community is not what it was 10 years ago. People understand wines. The kosher community has a great affinity for fantastic wines. And the Israelis, too. They're drinking some of the greatest wines. The people who want kosher appreciate that it's kosher. The people who don't need kosher don't really care that it's kosher. It doesn't bother anybody. In America, when they're drinking a great bottle of 94 rated Yatir wine, they don't really care that it's kosher. They look, oh, Israeli, nice.
So we learned, we ate, we drank. There is only one way to conclude this report. L'chaim.
Wow. So it's great that kosher wine is getting a lot better because like 20 years ago, it had this reputation of being terrible.
It's just a stereotype. You learned it's the exact same ingredients. It's just the process of who's observing the process. That's what makes the difference.
Looks like a
David.
Okay, I take it back. Looks like it was a lot of fun to be there. You know who needs to drink a lot of wine?
Who?
Prince William. He's complaining about the stresses of parenthood. This guy's complaining. I got something to say about that ahead. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closed this day at the New York Stock Exchange up by 330 points.
But even with those gains, it was still the worst week in 2 years. Correspondent Maggie Rulli has the story.
Then with that, a roller coaster week on Wall Street ends just above 24,000, ending the day about 330 points up. Investors still skittish after yesterday's 1,000-point plunge, the second biggest one-day point drop in history. The biggest? That happened just 4 days ago on Monday. The Dow's now down more than 10% from its high in January, and what analysts are calling an official correction.
It's a bit like a wildfire. It's good when you can burn some of the brush off so that you don't get a massive wildfire. I think we're just burning off some of the froth in the equity markets so that a much bigger bear market correction doesn't happen.
Experts insist the economy is doing well, but these positive developments could be having a negative impact on investors. Many worried that the economy is doing too well too quickly and that the Federal Reserve may hike rates in order to keep inflation under control.
The real concern is that if we get good news, it suggests that actually maybe our economy might be overheating.
Experts remind us that now is not the time to be afraid.
Do not jeopardize your long-term financial security based on short-term volatility. Look at the big picture. The fact is the economy's growing, and if you're investing for years or decades, this is a good buying opportunity.
Big picture. That's also the way to approach parenting. But Prince William is looking at the short term, and he's getting a lot of flack for saying that something that every parent knows, that it's exhausting.
Well, the prince, whose wife is expecting their third child right now, reportedly told friends at a recent gathering that he's trying to get as much sleep as possible before the new baby comes. The couple are already parents to 4-year-old Prince George and 2-year-old Princess Charlotte. The prince also responded to reports that his wife is expecting twins, saying that his mental health would be tested if that happened.
Oh, the poor prince. He's not getting any sleep at Buckingham Palace because he only has, what, 4 night nurses and a dozen maids and all sorts of other people to help?
As a parent, do you have something to tell him?
Yeah,
You can
I
look
think he
straight
should
at the
come
camera.
to our place at the Upper West Side and do it by yourself with you and just your wife, and then you'll know what exhaustion really is.
Well, I've been watching The Crown. It's also a tough job.
It's tough. Look, actually, to be fair, it's, you know what, even if you have a lot of help, it is tiring, but it's worth it.
Right, a lot of responsibilities there. Yeah. All right, and that does it for this hour of Crossroads.
Stay with us on I-24 News for much more. We are not exhausted, at least not yet.
But we are royals.
The show continues.